The Philippines during martial law. Ferdinand Edrelin Marcos was born on September 11, 1917 in Sarat, Ilocos Norte, Philippines. Died on September 28, 1989 in Honolulu, Hawaii, US. He became the president since 1966 to 1986 and established an authoritarian regime in the Philippines that came under criticism for corruption and its suppression of democratic processes. And Marcos attended school in Manila and studied law in the late 1930s at the University of the Philippines. And on May 1, 1954, Ferdinand Marcos married the beauty queen Imelda Romualdez. Imelda helped propel Marcos to the presidential palace, and she was rewarded with a series of political appointments. Imelda's enormous shoe collection would come to represent the excess of Marcos' regime. So what is all about Ferdinand Edrelin Marcos? Ferdinand Edrelin Marcos was a son of a politician, and he practiced as a trial lawyer before serving under Manuel Rojas. And Manuel Rojas is the first president of the independent Philippines. He was himself elected president in 1966. In 1972, he imposed the martial law. During the World War II, he was an officer with the Philippine Armed Forces. He ran as the National Party candidate for the president against Liberal President Diosdado Macapagal in 1965. The campaign was expensive and bitter, but Marcos won and inaugurated as president on December 30, 1965. In 1969, he was reelected, becoming the first Philippine president to serve a second term. In his first term, Marcos made progress in agriculture, industry, and education. Yet, his administration was troubled by increasing student demonstrations and violent urban guerrilla activities. His later years in power were noted for rampant government corruption, economic stagnation, political repression, and the steady growth of a communist insurgency. He imposed the martial law on September 21, 1972, holding that communist and subversive forces had precipitated the crisis. He acted swiftly, opposition politicians were jailed, and the armed forces became also criticized an arm by of the church leaders and others. He was also opposed by political leaders, notably Benigno Aquino Jr., who was jailed and held in detention for almost 8 years. Marcos was also criticized by church leaders and others. In the provinces of Maoist communists or the New People's Army and Muslim separatists, notably of the Moro National Liberation Front, undertook the guerrilla activities intended to bring down the central government. The president assumed extraordinary powers, including the ability to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is an ancient common law writ issued by a court or judge directing one who holds another in custody to produce the person before the court for some specified purpose. Although there have been and there are many varieties of the writ, the most important is that used to correct violations of personal liberty and directing judicial inquiry into the illegality of a detention. The habeas corpus remedy is recognized in the countries of the Anglo-American legal system but is generally not found in civil law countries, although some of the latter have adopted comparable procedures. Marcos announced the end of martial law in January 1981, but he continued to rule in an authoritarian fashion under various constitutional formats. He won election to the newly created post of president against token opposition in June 1981. The wife of Marcos from 1954 was Imelda Romualdez Marcos, a former beauty queen. Imelda became a powerful figure after the institution of martial law in 1972. She was often criticized for her appointments of relatives to lucrative governmental and industrial positions while she held the post of governor of Metropolitan Manila in 1975 to 1986 and Minister of Human Settlements and Ecology in 1979 to 1986. Marcos' later years in power were marred by rampant government corruption, economic stagnation, the steady widening of economic inequalities between the rich and the poor, and the steady growth of a communist guerrilla insurgency active in the rural areas of the Philippines' innumerable islands. By 1983, Marcos's health was beginning to fail, and opposition to his rule was growing. Additional information about martial law in the Philippines. The declaration issued under Proclamation 1081 suspended in the civil rights and imposed military authority in the country. Marcos defended the declaration, stressing the need for extra powers and quelled the rising wave of violence allegedly caused by communists. The emergency rule was also intended to eradicate the roots of rebellion and promote a rapid trend for national development. Autocrat assured the country of legality of martial law, emphasizing the need for control over civil disobedience that display lawlessness. Marcos explained, citing the provisions from the Philippine Constitution, that martial law is a strategic approach to legally defend the Constitution and protect the welfare of Filipino people from the dangerous threats posed by Muslim rebel groups and Christian vigilantes that places national security at risk during the time. Marcos explained that martial law was not a military takeover but was then the only option to resolve the country's dilemma on rebellion that stages national chaos, threatening the peace and order of the country. The emergency rule, according to Marcos' plan, was to lead the country into what he calls the new society. Marcos used several events to justify martial law threat to the country's security was intensifying following the re-establishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, in 1968. Supporters of CPP's military arm, the New People's Army, also grew in numbers in Tarlac and other parts of the country. The alleged attempt to the life of the Minister of Defense Juan Ponce Enrile gave Marcos a window to declare martial law. Marcos announced the emergency rule the day after the shooting incident. Marcos also declared the insurgency in the south caused by the clash between Muslims and Christians, which Marcos considered as a threat to national security. The Muslims were defending their ancestral land against the control of Christians who migrated in the area, and the minority group organized the Moro National Liberation Front in Malaysia and pushed for the autonomy of Mindanao from the national government. The move was initially supported by most Filipinos and was viewed by some critics as a change that solved the massive corruption in the country. Martial law sees the clash between the executive and legislative branches of the government and a bureaucracy characterized by special interest. Marcos is stated to implement reforms on social and political values that hindered effective modernization. To match the accomplishments of Asian neighbors, Marcos imposed the need for self-sacrifice for the attainment of national welfare. His reforms targeted his rivals, with the elite depriving them of their power and patronage but did not affect their supporters. In U.S. Library Congress, Martial Law and Aftermath. 30,000 opposition figures including Senator Benigno Aquino, journalist, student, and labor activists were defined at military compounds under the president's command. The Army and the Philippine Constabulary seized weapons and disbanded private armies controlled by prominent politicians and other influential figures. Marcos took control of the legislature and closed the Congress. Numerous media outfits were either closed down or operated under fight control. Marcos also allegedly funneled millions of the country's money by placing some of his trusted supporters in strategic economic positions to channel resources to him. Experts call this corny capitalism. The deterioration of the political and economic condition of the Philippines triggered the decline of support on Marcos' plans. More and more Filipinos took arms to dislodge the regime. Urban poor communities in the country's capital were organized by the Philippine Ecumenical Council for Community and were soon conducting protest masses and prayer rallies. These efforts, including the exposure of numerous human rights violations, pushed Marcos to hold an election in 1978 and 1981 in an aim to stabilize the country's chaotic condition. Marcos in both events won the election. However, his extended term as President of the Republic of the Philippines elicited an extensive opposition against his regime. In here, you can see Benigno Aquino Jr. and Corazon Aquino. I'll just give some side stories about these two people. Hoping to present an alternative to both Marcos and the increasingly powerful New People's Army, Benigno Aquino Jr. returned to Manila on August 21, 1983, only to be shot dead as he stepped off the airplane. The assassination was seen as the work of the government and touch of massive anti-government protest. An independent commission appointed by Marcos concluded in 1984 that high military officers were responsible for Aquino's assassination. To reassert his mandate, Marcos called for presidential elections to be held in 1986. But a formidable political opponent soon emerged in Aquino's widow, Corazon Aquino, who became the presidential candidate of the opposition. It was widely asserted that Marcos managed to defeat Aquino and retain the presidency in the election of February 7, 1986, only through massive voting fraud of the part of his supporters. Deeply discredited at home and abroad by his dubious electoral victory, Marcos held fast to his presidency as the Philippine military split between supporters of his and Aquino's legitimate right to the presidency. A tense standoff that ensued between the two sides ended only when Marcos fled the country on February 25, 1986 at U.S. urging. He went into exile in Hawaii where he remained until his death. Evidence emerged that during his years in power, Marcos, his family, and his close associates had looted the Philippines' economy of billions of dollars through embezzlements and other corrupt practices. Marcos and his wife were subsequently indicted by the U.S. government on racketeering charges, but in 1990, after Marcos' death, Imelda was acquitted of all the charges by a federal court. She was only allowed to return to the Philippines in 1991, and in 1993, a Philippine court found her guilty of corruption. The conviction was overturned in 1998. So this is our report about the Philippines during martial law. Thank you for listening.